The screams rang out across the grand dining room as blood spilled over the white tablecloth. Master Hathaway clutched his throat, his wife collapsed beside him, and their children twisted in agony. In the kitchen doorway stood Mercy Allen, the enslaved woman who had served the family for 15 years, watching silently as the ground glass she had hidden in their bread tore through their insides. Without a word, she turned, slipped out the back door, and vanished into the Alabama night, never to be seen again. What could drive a woman known for kindness to commit such horror? And what fate awaited her after she disappeared into the dark? The year was 1847, and Hathaway Plantation stretched across 2,000 acres of Alabama's soil. The cotton fields rolled like white-tipped waves under the burning sun, while the mansion loomed with tall white columns and wide porches, a picture of Southern wealth built on the backs of 43 enslaved men, women, and children who worked from dawn until nightfall in conditions meant to crush the spirit. Mercy had been born there 28 years earlier in the cramped slave quarters behind the house. Her mother, Ruth, had been the plantation's head cook, and from the moment Mercy could walk, she had stood beside her, learning how to command the kitchen. The vast hearth, heavy iron pots and shelves, lined with exotic spices from faraway ports, became Mercy's world. But her mother taught her more than recipes. Ruth whispered survival into her ear, how to stay quiet, how to keep thoughts hidden, how to endure. That wisdom had kept Ruth alive for 43 years, and she prayed it would keep her daughter alive as well. Jefferson Hathaway, the master of the estate, was a man with sharp blue eyes and little warmth. He had inherited the land and built it into a larger empire, with every harvest purchasing more acres and more enslaved laborers. His wife Cordelia, pale and frail, spent her days behind embroidery hoops or piano keys, speaking to slaves only through her husband or the overseer. Their sons, Charles and Robert, 13 years old, in 1847, had been raised to believe the enslaved people were less than human. They ordered them about issued punishments for imagined wrongs and delighted in the power their position gave them. Mercy had watched them grow from infants she once nursed and cared for into cruel copies of their father. She had fed them, healed their childhood fevers, and even carried a touch of maternal affection once. But as they grew, that feeling soured. By the time their laughter turned to mocking threats, whatever tenderness she once held for them had hardened into something else entirely. The kitchen, where Mercy spent nearly every waking hour, sat in a separate building behind the main house, joined to it by a covered walkway. On southern plantations, this design was common. It kept the smoke, heat, and noise of cooking away from the family's living quarters. But for Mercy, that kitchen was more than a workspace. It was the center of her world, a place she had known since childhood, where every stone in the hearth and every worn groove in the wooden floor held memory. She rose before dawn each day, lighting the fire and preparing the Hathaway family's breakfast. Nothing could ever be simple. They expected their mornings to begin with fresh biscuits dripping with butter and honey scrambled eggs, sausage or bacon, creamy grits, and when the season allowed, bowls of ripe fruit. Each dish had to be flawless, timed perfectly, and served just as the family preferred. Once breakfast ended, her focus shifted immediately to the midday meal, the grandest of the day. Dinner in the evening was lighter, but no less exacting. Beyond cooking, Mercy kept track of food supplies, planned menus from the plantation's gardens and livestock, and oversaw the younger enslaved workers who carried dishes and served at table. Her role gave her a rare measure of authority, but it also placed her under constant scrutiny. Silas Crawford, the overseer, was especially watchful of her. Officially, he came to check provisions or pass along instructions, but Mercy knew his real aim was to intimidate, to remind her that he held power over her life. Crawford was a hardened man in his 40s, with skin toughened by sun and cruelty in his eyes. Hired 5 years earlier after the last overseer succumbed to fever, he quickly cemented his authority through violence. His whip was always at his side, and most of the enslaved people bore marks of his anger. Mercy had survived 15 years in this brutal world by following her mother's teachings, keeping her head down, working efficiently, never letting her thoughts show. She had endured loss after loss, friends and family members sold away, others beaten or killed. And each time she forced her grief deep inside, where it couldn't be used against her. The kitchen, for all its burdens, had been her refuge, the one space where her skills mattered even if she did not. But by the summer of 1847, something inside Mercy began to shift. What started as quiet unease soon grew into a deeper unrest. The Hathaways had always been harsh, but their cruelty was hardening. Master Hathaway, drinking more than ever, had grown reckless and violent. His temper flared without warning, and his debts pushed him to desperate measures. When he sold 3 slaves to pay gambling losses, he tore families apart without hesitation. Among those taken was Mary, a young woman who had been like a sister to Mercy since childhood. That betrayal cut deeper than any wound, and the resentment Mercy had tried to bury began to rise. The day Mary was chained and hauled away, Mercy had stood frozen at the kitchen window, watching the wagon roll down the dusty road until it disappeared from sight. She had wanted to scream, to run after it, to fight with every ounce of strength she had left. Instead, she turned back to the fire, her hands moving through the motions of preparing supper as if nothing had changed, though inside something had broken loose. It was a crack in the wall of silence and control she had built around herself, and over the following weeks, that crack only widened. Charles and Robert seemed determined to make life unbearable. They delighted in tormenting the younger enslaved children, their cruelty escalating as if it were a game. Just the week before, Mercy had watched them force a 10-year-old boy named David to crawl on all fours while they rode on his back, striking him with a switch when he collapsed. Mercy had tried to help the boy, sneaking him water and tending his wounds. But Master Hathaway had caught her and struck her across the face, warning her not to interfere again. Cordelia had witnessed the entire scene from her rocking chair on the porch, sipping lemonade with an expression as calm as if she were watching the weather, and that indifference cut Mercy deeper than the blow itself. Cruelty born of anger, she could understand, but the cold dismissal of suffering, the belief that others were not even human, was harder to endure. 3 days before the night that would change everything, Mercy had reached her breaking point. She was working in the kitchen when she overheard raised voices coming from the study. Creeping close to the window, she listened as Master Hathaway and Crawford discussed selling more slaves to pay his gambling debts. When her own name was mentioned, her blood ran cold. Within weeks, she was to be sent to a Mississippi plantation. The thought of being ripped from the only place she had ever known, from the few ties of family and memory that remained, filled her with despair. But what followed was worse. Hathaway laughed as he told Crawford about the high price he would fetch for her, making crude jokes about the buyer's reputation for working female slaves in ways that had nothing to do with field labor. The casual way they spoke about her body, her fate, as though she were less than cattle, lit something inside her. She had never allowed herself to feel pure rage. That night she lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, realizing that all her years of silence and obedience had bought her nothing but betrayal. For nearly 3 decades she had swallowed her pride, endured every cruelty, hidden her pain, and for what? To be sold off like a broodmare, left to suffer in ways that might make even this life seem merciful. By morning she moved with her usual quiet efficiency, but nothing was the same. As she served breakfast, she studied the family with sharp, calculating eyes. She noticed details she had ignored before: the way Master Hathaway's hands trembled as he lifted his coffee cup, a tremor born from drink. Cordelia's distracted fidgeting, her eyes always elsewhere. The twins' arrogance sharpened, but careless. For the first time, she wasn't just seeing them as her masters. She was studying them as prey. Mercy had begun to see them differently. Cordelia frail and fading, nibbling at her food, without appetite. Charles and Robert stuffing themselves with the careless hunger of boys who had never once felt hunger or fear. And Master Hathaway himself, depending on her hands, never imagining that the woman who prepared his meals might harbor thoughts of her own. Their lives, their comfort, their very survival, rested in the trust they placed in her trust they never thought to question. That was when the idea, once a faint whisper, began to roar. She tried to smother it, telling herself it was madness, that such thoughts would bring ruin not only to her but to every enslaved soul on the plantation. Yet the thought would not die. By the third morning, her decision was set. She would not be sold. She would not live out her years under strangers' cruelty. She would seize control of her fate, even if it led her straight into damnation. That morning, as she lit the kitchen fires, a strange calm spread through her. The fear and tension that had pressed on her for months melted into cold, steady resolve. To anyone watching, the day passed as it always had. Mercy cooked, cleaned, planned meals, tended the garden, and supervised younger servants. But inside, she was preparing for battle. The weapon she chose was simple and deadly. In the storage room sat a row of empty wine bottles, souvenirs of Hathaway's vanity. Mercy selected the largest, a dark green burgundy bottle, and carried it to a quiet corner. Wrapping it in cloth, she smashed it with an iron pot until it lay in jagged shards, then spent nearly an hour grinding those shards into a fine, deadly powder. The work was slow, steady, almost meditative, each strike of the pot deepening her resolve. This was no rash act of anger. It was deliberate, calculated, fully conscious of the cost. When she finished, she poured the powder into a cloth bag and buried it beneath sacks of flour. Every trace of her work was swept away. By afternoon, she returned to her routine, outwardly unchanged, inwardly transformed. The day felt suspended, each action ritualistic, as though she were preparing not a meal, but a sacrifice. She harvested vegetables with unusual care, selected a well-cured ham from the smokehouse, and arranged the ingredients as if for a feast. As the sun dropped and shadows stretched long across the plantation, Mercy set to her final task, baking the bread. She had made it thousands of times, golden and soft-touched with molasses. Sweetness bread the Hathaways devoured with butter and honey, never pausing to consider whose hands shaped it. Tonight the bread would carry her answer to every cruelty, every loss, every betrayal. Tonight it would become her weapon. Tonight's bread was unlike any Mercy had ever baked. As she stirred flour water, yeast, and molasses together, her hands moved with practiced ease, but her mind felt strangely detached, as though she were watching someone else perform the task. She kneaded the dough carefully, just as her mother had taught her, until it was smooth and elastic. Then came the moment of decision. She untied the small cloth bag, tipped its contents into the bowl, and watched the ground glass vanish into the pale mixture. It blended so seamlessly that no eye, no tongue would ever know it was there. Only the body would learn the truth, and by then, it would be far too late. She worked the powder in thoroughly until the dough felt no different than any other she had prepared. Still, she knew the shards were waiting tiny blades that would turn nourishment into a death sentence. Once the loaves were shaped and left to rise, she moved on with the rest of her duties as though nothing had changed. She glazed the ham until it gleamed with honey and mustard, seasoned the vegetables with herbs she had grown herself, and polished the family's fine china and crystal. Every detail mattered. If this was to be the Hathaway family's final meal, it would be perfect in every way. The smell of baking bread soon filled the kitchen rich. and comforting, a scent Mercy had always associated with home and labor. But this time it carried another meaning: freedom. As she inhaled the aroma, her thoughts turned to Ruth. Her mother's final words had been a promise. "Someday you'll be free, child. Maybe not here, but someday." At the time, Mercy believed Ruth spoke of heaven. Now, standing in the dim kitchen with the bread cooling on the counter, she wondered if her mother had meant something else, a freedom seized, not given. When the meal was finished, it looked worthy of celebration. The ham, dark and fragrant, rested at the center of a grand platter framed by tender vegetables glistening with butter. The bread lay in a basket, lined with white cloth, golden and warm, hiding its lethal secret beneath a flawless crust. Everything appeared exactly as the Hathaways expected from their devoted cook. Carrying the dishes into the dining room, Mercy felt an almost ceremonial calm. Candlelight shimmered across the polished mahogany table, dancing in the crystal glasses and silver cutlery. The family was already in place. Jefferson Hathaway presiding at the head, Cordelia fragile at his side, Charles and Robert facing each other with the restless energy of boys on the edge of manhood. They did not look at her as she served them. They never did. To them, she was an invisible hand, a servant without face or thought, moving quietly around the table while they drank, ate, and spoke of their affairs. But tonight, unseen and unheard as always, she was no longer their servant. Tonight, she was their reckoning. The Hathaways carried on with their evening as if nothing in the world could touch them. Master Hathaway grumbled about cotton prices and the struggle to find buyers for the coming harvest. Cordelia, thin and distracted, outlined plans for an upcoming dinner party, casually assigning every detail to Mercy without even looking at her. Charles and Robert bickered about their weekend plans, arguing over whether hunting or fishing would prove more entertaining. To Mercy, it felt like watching a stage play, these people so certain of their futures, speaking of days ahead they would never see. When she set the basket of bread on the table, Hathaway reached for it immediately, as she knew he would. Bread was always his first test of a meal. He tore into it with satisfaction, praising its flavor between sips of wine. Cordelia picked daintily at her slice, nibbling in her usual distracted manner. The twins grabbed thick pieces, their growing appetites driving them to devour everything in sight. Mercy stood by the sideboard, her expression the mask of a servant offering no clue to the storm inside her. For several minutes, nothing happened. The family ate, talked, and laughed, moving on to ham and vegetables as if it were any other evening. A sliver of doubt pierced her calm. Had the plan failed? Had the glass been too fine, too little, or somehow dulled in the baking? Then it began. Hathaway paused mid-bite, his brow furrowing as his hand moved to his throat. He took a swallow of wine, expecting relief, but instead, his face contorted in pain. Cordelia froze with a fragment of bread in her hand, her eyes widening with dawning terror. The twins reacted first, their young bodies overwhelmed. Charles dropped his fork and clutched his throat, choking out a strangled cry. Robert folded forward, retching violently, crimson streaks spilling from the corners of his mouth onto the pristine tablecloth. The bright red spread across the white linen like roses blooming in fast motion. Hathaway pushed back his chair, scraping it across the floor as he struggled to rise, but his legs wavered beneath him. His throat convulsed as he tried to speak, only for thick, wet sounds to emerge. Blood trickled from his lips, soaking into his shirt front in dark spreading stains. Cordelia's scream cut through the room, shrill and raw, her hands clawing at her own neck as if she could tear the agony away. Her carefully composed image, her hair, her delicate posture unraveled as she twisted in pain. What had begun as a simple dinner turned into a grotesque spectacle. The family that had commanded every moment of Mercy's life for nearly 3 decades now convulsed in their seats, undone by the very bread they had trusted her to make. The polished dining room, lit by candles and set with fine silver, had become a place of nightmare. Blood spread across the linen, cries of agony echoed against the walls, and at the center of it all stood Mercy, silent and watchful, the invisible servant at last revealed as their reckoning. Instead of triumph, Mercy felt a hollow stillness settle over her, as if she were drifting outside her own body, watching the scene unfold from far away. The weight of what she had done pressed down on her, not just the sight of the Hathaways writhing in their own blood, but the certainty of what would follow once their deaths were discovered. Every enslaved person on the plantation would fall under suspicion, and Crawford's vengeance would be merciless. Master Hathaway slumped in his chair, gasping for air, his face pale, except for the bright streaks of blood running down his chin. His cold blue eyes that had dismissed her for nearly 3 decades, locked on her face now with bewildered accusation, as if he could not fathom that the woman who had cooked for him could also destroy him. Cordelia had tumbled from her seat, crawling weakly across the polished floor, dragging a trail of blood behind her. Her silks were ruined, her dignity stripped away, her screams reduced to a thin, wavering wail that sounded less human with each breath. The twins fared no better. Charles convulsed in his chair, his eyes darting wildly, pleading for a rescue that would never come. Robert lay unconscious, his breathing shallow blood seeping from his mouth into the floorboards beneath his head. The stately dining room, so often filled with the sounds of clinking silver and idle conversation, had become a chamber of death. The grandfather clock ticked with mechanical indifference, its steady beat mocking the chaos. Candles flickered in their silver holders, throwing distorted shadows across the blood-smeared table where untouched ham and vegetables sat cooling. Mercy stood motionless, time stretching unnaturally as she absorbed the consequences of her choice. She felt no justice, no satisfaction, only the crushing awareness that she had crossed into a place from which there was no return. When the family's cries weakened and fell into silence, she finally turned away. Her legs trembled, but she forced them forward back into the kitchen. There her movements became purposeful, steady. She gathered the few belongings that tethered her to a life that had never been hers. A spare set of clothes, a small wooden cross her mother had carved, and a handful of sentimental trinkets. She wrapped bread, cheese, and dried meat into her bundle enough to last a few days. At the kitchen window, she paused, gazing out at the main house. Its glowing windows looked serene from the outside, concealing the horror within the bloody price of cruelty long inflicted and finally repaid. Her thoughts turned briefly to the others, still asleep in their quarters. They did not yet know the storm that was about to descend. The interrogations, the punishments, the terror. The guilt gnawed at her, but she pushed it down. She had chosen this path, and now she had to walk it. The back door creaked as it opened, the same sound she had heard countless times before. Only tonight, it was not the sound of routine, but of departure. She stepped into the cool September night, the stars sharp above the dark tree line, the scent of apples and smoke in the air. Drawing her shawl close around her shoulders, Mercy walked toward the woods. She had no plan, no destination, only the desperate need to leave behind the house that had stolen her life and the bodies that bore witness to her vengeance. The Underground Railroad was little more than whispered legend in this part of Alabama. And Mercy knew she had no allies waiting, no hidden stations to guide her north. She would have to trust her instincts and pray that luck might carry her where planning could not. At the edge of the woods, she turned for one final look. The big house stood tall against the night sky, its white columns catching faint starlight, its grandeur still intact on the outside, though ruin festered within. The kitchen where she had spent her life was dark now, its fire finally left to die. The quarters of the enslaved were silent, their occupants unaware that everything had already changed. She wondered how her story would be told in the days and years ahead. Would she be remembered as a mad woman, her act twisted into a cautionary tale used to justify harsher chains and cruelties? Or would someone someday understand the desperation that drove her to act? Perhaps masters would see her story as a warning of what happens when people are pushed too far, though more likely it would be used to tighten their grip. Mercy herself could not decide what to make of her actions. She had crossed a line she once thought impossible, and the knowledge that she had killed sat heavy in her chest. Yet at the same time, she had done something she had never been allowed before she had chosen. Not obeyed, not endured. Chosen. And that choice, however terrible, made her into someone new. No longer Mercy the obedient cook. No longer the invisible slave who bent her head and held her tongue. Tonight she had become Mercy the fugitive, Mercy the avenger, Mercy the free woman whose liberty had been purchased in blood. The woods swallowed her as she stepped into their cover, the night cool and sharp with the smell of smoke and apples. Behind her, silence claimed the plantation house, its candles burning lower over a table surrounded by the dead. By morning, the scene would be discovered, and Crawford's hunt would begin. But for now, Mercy Allen walked under the stars, a free woman on borrowed time. Her path was unmarked, guided only by instinct. She followed the narrow deer trails and the winding lines of creek beds that seemed to point her north. She had heard of others who made it to the free states, but those stories usually ended in chains and brutal punishment. The road was impossibly long, filled with dogs, slave catchers, and hostile land. Yet there was no turning back. She had chosen her course, and every step forward was another cut from the ties that had bound her. Practical thoughts filled her mind as the adrenaline eased into steady determination. She would need food and water, shelter, a way to keep ahead of those who would pursue her without rest. She had no money, no maps, no allies, only a bundle of bread, cheese, and dried meat that might last 3 days, a carved wooden cross, and her will to survive. The sounds of the night pressed in on her branches, snapping leaves, shifting animal calls echoing in the dark. Every noise felt like a threat, but she moved carefully, balancing speed with silence. Hours later, when the first pale light of dawn began to stain the horizon, Mercy allowed herself to stop. She found cover in a dense thicket by a small stream. The water was cold and clean, and she drank deeply, her thirst reminding her how far she had already come. Sitting in the damp grass, she opened her bundle, rationed a small piece of food, and let the exhaustion of the night settle over her. The world ahead was full of danger, but for the first time in her life, the next step belonged to her. The clothes on her back still marked her as a slave, but Mercy had nothing else to change into. So she shoved deeper into the rock maze and pressed herself against cold stone, breathing as quietly as the moss around her, listening to the hounds and men move like a bad dream above. For a long hour, the forest sounded like a single terrible machine. Barking hooves shouted names and curses, then the noise began to thin as the searchers followed the creek in the opposite direction, convinced she had doubled back or fled toward the main road. And when the last bark faded, Mercy let out the breath she had been holding and felt the first honest tremor of relief. Her hands ached from the descent, her skin was a map of scratches, and her face had a new hardness to it. But inside that hardness, there was also a small spark of planning, a list of things she needed to survive the next stretch of wilderness. She scooped up a handful of cool water from a trickle that ran through a crevice, chewed on a bit of dried meat until her jaw complained, and in the dim light, she stripped a long strip from the hem of her skirt to bind a bleeding wrist, all the while watching the ways the light and shade moved through the boulders, so she could memorize exits and hiding places. Over the next days, she lived inside that stone labyrinth, slipping out at dusk to follow game trails and steal corn from an unattended field trading speed for caution, and making a habit of sleeping with one ear open and one eye on the sky. And slowly, she learned to read tracks and the subtle changes in bird song that told her whether humans had been near. Once a lone rider passed close enough that Mercy flattened herself into a fissure and felt the horse breathe hot on her cheek, and the rider rode on without noticing anything but the weather. Other nights, she scavenged clothing cast off by hunters or took a jacket from a hung-up line at an isolated cabin. While its owners argued inside about politics and the price of cotton, and each scrap she added felt like a small theft of the life they had kept from her. The fear never fully left, but it grew steadier, shaped now by skill and cold resolve instead of panic. And as she moved northward in fits and starts, she kept the memory of the dining room like a lodestar for what she had abandoned and what she might never reclaim, knowing that freedom would be earned one slow, dangerous mile at a time. Mercy watched the hunters sleep from the shadow line, studying how they clustered by the fire, how one kept nodding off with his hand on his pistol, how the hounds lay with their legs twitching and tongues lolling, and she felt a cold, practical clarity settle over her. She could smash their mobility by stealing or scattering the horses, but that alone would only slow them. So she decided on something that would buy her the most time and turn their confidence into chaos. She crept closer until the steam from the horses' flanks mixed with her breath, then moved like a silent shadow among the pickets, cutting tether ropes with a knife she had hidden in the hem of her skirt and loosening picket pins where the ground was soft and careful to leave no obvious trace of tampering. And when two of the men woke and swore, she stepped from the brush and set a small fire in a pile of dry leaves near the edge of the camp to send sparks into their sleeping area, not to hurt them, but to force them to rise in panic, to untangle geldings and mares in blind confusion. The hounds yelped and leapt free, collars rattling, and the riders cursed and scattered in different directions, trying to gather mounts and hounds, while Mercy slipped back into the trees with the soft whine of horses and human voices behind her, feeling the sick twist of what she had done and the sharp relief that came with it, knowing this wrecking of their order would slow the hunt long enough for her to put miles between herself and the plantation, and to turn the men into hunted, unsure and scrambling, which was the only leverage she could hope for on this road north. Mercy slipped deeper into the stone maze, curling into a narrow chamber, where she could hear every sound of the hunt. The dogs' baying drew closer, echoing through the trees with desperate excitement, and men's voices barked orders as they pressed in from every direction. She caught Crawford's harsh tone among them, sharp, commanding, relentless. The sound of boots scraping rock and dogs whining filled the air. And once so close above her hiding place, pebbles and dirt showered down as if they might expose her at any second. But the rocks scattered her scent, and confusion spread among the hounds until the pack grew restless and Crawford's curses turned the search chaotic. Hours passed before the forest stilled again. Mercy waited until full dark before creeping from her hiding place, knowing the men would not stop until she was either caught or dead. They had horses, dogs, and firepower. She had only her wits, but as she moved through the night, she realized something had shifted inside her. Running alone would never be enough. If she wanted to survive, she had to end the pursuit. Watching from the shadows, she saw Crawford at dawn, his face lit by firelight, giving orders and checking weapons. He had been the whip, the fear, the cruelty behind Hathaway's power. Without him, the others would be nothing more than hired muscle, likely eager to abandon the chase. When he walked alone to the stream, Mercy followed, gripping a club fashioned from deadwood. Her heart hammered, but her mind was sharp. She stepped out of the shadows, swung with all her strength, and dropped him into the shallow water. blood spread like ink through the current. She stripped his weapons and ammunition, then rushed back into camp to drive the horses into chaos, shouting and striking until the animals bolted into the trees. By the time the hunters discovered what had happened, Crawford was dead, their mounts scattered, their leader gone. Mercy was already vanishing into the wilderness with his rifle on her back. Word of Crawford's death spread quickly. In taverns, on porches along dusty roads, the story grew with every retelling. No longer just a runaway, she became a ghost in the woods. A slave woman turned killer, striking from the shadows. Fear magnified her presence. Isolated farms bolted their doors. Patrols grew cautious. Travelers gathered in wary groups. She had become a legend of terror, and the fear she inspired shielded her as much as her cunning. But with the legend came hunters of a different kind. Bounty men, hard-eyed and seasoned, lured by the reward posted on her head. They were colder, more skilled than Crawford's men, and they came with discipline rather than arrogance. Mercy learned to adapt, avoiding roads, living off roots, berries, and game-setting snares, and reading the signs of the forest like scripture. She became harder, quieter, more dangerous. With every mile north she walked, she shed more of who she had been, until the obedient cook called Mercy Allen was little more than a memory. What remained was someone new, an outlaw, a shadow, a woman who had written her freedom in blood and refused to surrender it. The kitchen that had once defined her days was now a distant memory, replaced by the raw struggle of survival. As Mercy pressed northward, the bright greens of summer gave way to autumn's bare branches, and with the falling leaves came new dangers. The forest no longer hid her as well, and each cold wind reminded her that winter would soon test her resolve, as no overseer ever had. Nights grew longer, colder, and more perilous, until she realized she would need more than courage to survive. Her answer came in the form of a forgotten cabin, half collapsed, and leaning against the slope of a mountain in northern Alabama, likely abandoned years ago by some pioneer who could not wrest a living from the rocky ground. It offered walls still sturdy enough to hold back the worst of the weather. With patience and effort, Mercy patched gaps with branches and mud-stacked stones to block the wind and turned the ruin into something livable. It was crude, but it was hers. There she passed the winter of 1847 into 1848. She lived on what she could hunt, with Crawford's stolen rifle squirrels, rabbits, the occasional deer, and on the nuts, roots, and dried berries she had gathered before the first frost. It was a thin and lonely existence, but also the first in her life where every choice, every action was her own. For the first time, she was not following orders. She was answering only to herself. Long nights by the fire gave her time to reckon with what she had done. The woman who had poured glass into bread and left the Hathaways writhing on their fine white tablecloth seemed almost like a ghost, someone she could barely recognize. Yet she knew that woman was part of her, the beginning of a transformation that had not stopped. Her hands, once used to kneading dough and polishing silver, were now rough and scarred, skilled with weapons and snares. Her face, once kept smooth in the shadows of a kitchen hearth, was hardened by wind and sun. Her body, once bent to domestic toil, was honed by hardship and hunger. But the greatest change was in her mind. She had learned to live in complete freedom, bearing the full weight of her choices and her survival. When spring finally broke through the mountains, she was ready. The snow melted into rushing streams, and the trees put out their first tender leaves. Mercy studied the ridges and valleys around her cabin, mapping the safest routes and memorizing landmarks. The road ahead would be long. Hundreds of miles still separated her from the free states. But she had endured enough to know she could meet what was coming. The men who had once hunted her might still be searching, but time and distance had dulled their resolve. Some would have turned back to easier prey. Her legend, though, had not faded. If anything, it had grown while she lay hidden in the mountains. Tales of the enslaved cook who had poisoned her master's family and felled the overseer in his own hunt spread like wildfire across the South. Few versions matched the truth. In some, she was said to be a conjure woman who commanded spirits and storms. In others, she was cast as a northern spy, trained in secret arts of assassination. To planters, she was a terror. To the enslaved, she was whispered about with awe. The truth of who she was, just one woman with nothing but her will to live, mattered less than what she had come to represent. The whispers and wild stories that followed her worked to Mercy's advantage as she pushed north. Talk of a dangerous runaway made local patrols hesitate and lone bounty hunters think twice. And that fear bought her breathing room. But it also drew harder eyes, federal agents and professional manhunters with reputations and rewards on their heads, now hunted her across state lines. She learned to read the hunters as if they were weather who moved in sloppy, noisy packs and who stalked with quiet skill. And she adjusted her tactics accordingly, slipping into rough country where supply lines and horses meant less, and her knowledge of routes, tracks, and shelter gave her the edge. By midsummer, she had left Alabama behind and crossed into Tennessee, still hundreds of miles from any official free state yet. For the first time, she let herself believe escape might be possible. That hope turned urgent when she rounded a ridge and realized the road below had been wired into a trap. Riders and men in hidden positions forming a net that would catch anyone trying to move through the woods the way she always had. The plan they laid out was experienced and patient perfect for snaring someone who followed the same predictable routes. But it depended on her playing the part they expected. So Mercy did the opposite of what every lesson in her life would have advised. She stepped onto the open road itself, betting that the hunters would not expect a black woman in slave dress to march boldly in plain sight, and counting on shock speed and the confusion she could cause to unpick their carefully set web. The legend Mercy had built carried her into that final confrontation. By choosing the open road instead of the forest, she turned the hunters' own expectations against them. The tense standoff at dawn crystallized everything she had become, no longer an invisible servant, but a figure of defiance, armed, resolute, and willing to meet violence with violence. The battle that followed was brutal, a test not just of skill, but of will. Her survival skills, honed over months of hunting and evading, gave her the precision to turn Crawford's pistol and rifle into extensions of her own determination. When the smoke cleared, 3 men were dead, and 1 young wounded and terrified remained. Her choice to spare him revealed the final stage of her transformation. Mercy had learned ruthlessness when necessary, but she had not lost the part of herself that still saw humanity, even in those sent to drag her back in chains. Her words, "Go home to your family and forget you ever saw me," were as much a declaration of her new identity as the first time she claimed her name and her purpose on that road. By then, she was no longer just a fugitive cook. She was a woman who had defied the system built to crush her, who had rewritten her own story with blood, cunning, and endurance. The South knew her as a legend, whispered with fear and awe. But to herself, she had finally become what she had always dreamed in secret, not property, not prey, but free. Mercy's final crossing into the free states closed the circle on a journey that had begun with a single desperate act in a plantation kitchen. The woman who had once been invisible at the Hathaway table now walked openly under a new name, Mary Freeman. Her freedom bought with blood, cunning, and a year of relentless pursuit. Her legend followed her north. In the South, she was painted as a monster, a conjure woman, or a dangerous rebel whose story justified harsher laws and tighter controls. Among the enslaved, her name was whispered with reverence, proof that resistance was possible. In the North, she became both a symbol and a shadow admired, but also feared for what her defiance represented. For a few brief years in Cincinnati, she carved out a life. She worked as a cook, saved money, and quietly aided the same network that had ferried her across the Ohio. She never married, never allowed herself the vulnerability of family, and remained wary of attachments that could be used against her. When the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 extended the reach of her enemies even into the so-called free states, her life once again became uncertain. Federal agents sought her out specifically, not just as an escaped slave, but as the embodiment of everything they feared: rebellion, resistance, and the possibility that others might follow her example. History did not record what ultimately became of Mercy Allen, or Mary Freeman, as she called herself in freedom. Some whispered she disappeared farther north, perhaps into Canada, where American laws could not touch her. Others said she joined abolitionist circles, more directly helping to smuggle fugitives across the Ohio by night. And still others claimed her end was violent, that bounty hunters eventually caught her and buried her in an unmarked grave. But the truth mattered less than the legend. To those who lived under chains, the story of Mercy Allen was proof that even the most invisible person could rise up, strike back, and claim freedom on their own terms. To those who held the chains, she was a nightmare that walked the roads of the South, a name that made them look twice at every cook, every servant, every quiet figure in the background. Her story began with a whisper and ended in myth. But in every telling, one thing remained unchanged. Mercy Allen had chosen her own fate. Her journey ended far from where it began, but the shape of it was unforgettable. In 1851, when the Fugitive Slave Act made even the free states dangerous ground, Mercy, living as Mary Freeman, pushed farther north, crossing from Detroit into Windsor, Ontario. The river crossing took only minutes, but it marked the completion of nearly 4 years of struggle, bloodshed, and determination. She had walked out of Alabama as an enslaved cook. She stepped into Canada as a free woman. In Ontario, Mercy built a new life. She settled near Toronto, where her skills in the kitchen became her livelihood. The hands that once kneaded bread for the Hathaways now crafted meals that brought her independence and dignity. She grew a catering business, serving neighbors and the growing community of Black refugees, and she gave back to those still making the dangerous journey. Her name, Mary Freeman, was both a shield and a declaration of the life she had claimed. But she carried the memory of the cost. The Hathaways, Crawford, the bounty hunters, they had died because she chose resistance over submission. That burden never left her, though she came to see it not as a stain, but as the price demanded by a cruel system. In Canada, she told her story not as confession, but as testimony. By the time the Civil War reshaped the world, she had fled. Mercy's voice had become a powerful one. In the abolitionist movement, her legend transformed into a rallying cry for freedom. When she died in Toronto in 1889, at the age of 70, her obituary called her a woman who paid for liberty with blood and used liberty to lift others. In the South, her name still stirred fear. In the North, it inspired awe. And in the small Canadian town where she had found peace, she was remembered simply as Mary Freeman, the woman who had survived, endured, and remade her life on her own terms. What began in silence and servitude ended in fire and legend. Mercy Allen, Mary Freeman, had walked out of the Hathaway kitchen into the Alabama night with nothing but desperation and resolve, and from that moment on, she never looked back. She killed when she had to, endured when she must, and built a life not as property, but as a free woman whose choices were her own. The cost had been staggering, measured in blood, exile, and solitude, yet the reward was something far greater than survival. She became living proof that even the most tightly bound chains could be broken. Her story carried weight far beyond her own lifetime. Among the enslaved, her name was whispered as a kind of promise that freedom was possible, that rebellion was not madness, but courage. Among masters, her tale was retold in tones of warning. A reminder that obedience could mask resolve, and that even the most trusted servant might harbor the fire of resistance. Among abolitionists, she became an emblem of the cruelty of the system itself. A system so vile that it had forced a gentle woman to grind glass into bread and watch a family die, rather than live another day in bondage. The plantation where it all began crumbled with time. The grand house lost its luster, the columns sagged and weeds swallowed the kitchen, where mercy's quiet revolution began. Yet the ruin mattered little because the story outlived the walls. Passed down through generations, it became less about dates and names than about spirit, the refusal to accept chains as permanent, the willingness to risk everything for the right to live free. Mercy Allen did not pass into memory as a victim or a villain, but as something rarer, a woman who seized her destiny with her own hands and reshaped it, whatever the cost. The bread had been baked, the blood spilled, and the road north walked until her name was carved into history. It was a tale of horror and heroism in equal measure. But above all, it was the story of one woman who decided that anything, even damnation, was better than slavery.